My name is Charlie Hadlock, and I teach at Michigan State University. Our paper is about panel data. It's called Panel Data Estimation in Finance, Parameter Inconsistency. And it's actually a methodological paper, so it has to do with a whole set of statistical issues, where we go and show that in most of the papers published in the top journals in finance that use a certain approach, authors are neglecting to check one of the key statistical assumptions behind their behind the methodology that they're using. And we show that that if you actually go and re-examine these papers, that most of the time you can actually prove statistically that this key underlying assumption called strict exogeneity is in fact violated. And what that means is that we show a large number of very influential papers are almost surely statistically incorrect and are not in fact estimating or measuring the thing that they purport or they think that they're measuring. And so it's a methodological paper showing there's widespread misuse of certain estimation techniques in finance, and therefore lots of really errors and things that we think we've learned about that we actually haven't learned about. So it's a somewhat controversial paper in some ways, but we think it's very important. The reason that we wrote this paper is for years I've been reading finance papers, writing my own papers, reviewing papers, and I realized that something I had learned in graduate school that's mentioned in some of the textbooks was something that finance authors were ignoring, and frankly I ignored it as well in a lot of my publications because I wasn't really familiar with it. And my co-author, Billy Greiser, and myself decided at one point we wanted to learn a lot about this issue. And as we learned about it and understood it, we realized that it was a very big issue in finance. And we decided to go and sort of investigate how important it actually was sort of empirically by looking at previous papers. And this, Billy was writing his PhD dissertation, so this was part of his dissertation research. And so he actually researched and looked at every published paper in a set of finance journals over the past 7 or 8 years. And we identified at every paper for which this could be an issue, which was several hundred papers, and we showed that all of them basically, with the exception of 2 or 3, completely ignored the issue. And we then decided to sort of re-examine all of those papers, and we had to learn a lot of the statistics. So this was something we knew that we had made the same error that others had made, and we didn't know whether it was a big deal or not, and we discovered in fact it was a very big deal. And we then, with the encouragement of the JFQA editorial team, really tried to offer researchers a set of very practical guidelines in the future so that they don't make this error in the future. Okay, and so there's basically, and the journal did a very good job in helping us mold the paper to a set of practical things that every single researcher can do who's using this panel data estimation techniques to quickly check whether this issue of strict exogeneity is in fact important or not. And we're really hoping that in the future people check this based on this publication. And as an example, I was just discussing a paper this morning here at the American Finance Association meetings, and the authors didn't check this issue. And so I pointed out that every paper in the future should check this strict exogeneity issue. And so we're hoping it will be quite an influential paper. In terms of what we recommend doing sort of as a first line approach for researchers is there something called a fixed effects estimation technique and a first difference estimation technique. And it turns out that if this strict exogeneity assumption is true, that both of those estimation techniques should give you the same answer or something very close to each other. With enough data, they should both give you the exact same statistical estimate. And so one way to quickly check whether this assumption may be violated is to estimate these things using these 2 techniques, fixed effects and first differences. In the prior literature, most people use fixed effects, some people use first differences. It's very rare for people to do both. If you do both and you get different answers, that almost surely means that you have a problem. And that's what we in fact showed is by looking at over 200 studies and then characterizing sort of the standard models that people are estimating, that much of the time, those 2 different approaches that should be equivalent if the assumption is true, give you drastically different answers. In some cases, one will say an effect is positive, and another will say it was negative. And so that was absolutely shocking to us. And so this is a very easy way for researchers to basically just change one little statistical command, which people probably use one versus the other out of convenience in many settings, to quickly check them both. And if you get different answers, then you almost surely have a problem. And then we go on to recommend some more formal tests. But we basically give a very quick and dirty way to check statistically with very little cost to the researcher whether this is likely to be a major issue that affects the economic inferences from the research study. So in terms of future research and the impact of our paper on future research, not only do we sort of recommend that all future researchers looking at data where they're looking at multiple observations on a firm or an individual over time, they should conduct these tests we recommend. But there is a new, very popular approach in corporate finance to doing something that's called instrumental variable estimation. And so that's basically trying to look at the effect of X on Y, where the variable X is being measured using information really outside of the realm of the research study. So it's things that are much more likely, for example, looking at the effect of weather on a firm's investment. So the weather is a natural process, so you can be pretty convinced that that's affecting other stuff rather than the other stuff, firms' cash flows or profits affecting the weather. Okay, so the new approach in a lot of finance is this instrumental variable approach. Now, what we point out in this paper, and again, the JFQA editorial team was very helpful in pushing us in this direction, is that even this new approach where you're coming up with variables that seem to be much more likely to identify the cause and effect relationship between a variable X and its effect on Y, that even in those contexts, this strict exogeneity issue is in fact also important, and it is something that can be tested. And so there's a thing called the fixed effects two-stage least squares estimator and the first difference two-stage least squares estimator. They're two approaches of taking some very outside information like weather and looking at how it affects something like a firm's profitability. And even in those contexts, we recommend comparing the two. And if they're different, then it tells you that there's a subtle statistical structural thing going on in the data that means that you can't just use standard statistical approaches. You have to think more deeply about this strict exogeneity issue, even in an instrumental variable context. Why did we pick the JFQA to publish this paper? Well, the paper is a very controversial paper because if you read it carefully, it basically says that a large number of papers published mostly in the other top finance journals are basically all, many of them are incorrect and misleading. Okay, and so the paper was a political football, and so we presented it at some very prestigious conferences with very low acceptance rates. But not surprisingly, we did have a hard time finding and targeting a journal that we thought would be open to a very critical paper that we were trying to make as constructive as possible. And so the JFQA has a reputation for publishing very careful work and taking a chance on a paper that says something important that doesn't always agree with the party line in terms of sort of the standard ways of doing things. And so we targeted that as an outlet, and during the process, the journal worked with us in terms of trying to make the research very practical and pushing us in a direction of, rather than just being destructive and saying here's what people have done wrong, trying to offer sort of some diagnostics to see whether the problem exists, and then to suggest some potential solutions. And so working with the JFQA was one of the more pleasurable experience I've had working with a journal in terms of the finished product was a much better, I think is a much more influential paper and study than the original draft that we sent the journal. So we picked the journal because we thought they would be open to a somewhat controversial paper that we thought was important, but was non-standard and critical of a lot of papers out there in some of the other journals.